At midnight, I heard my name called by voices that were not supposed to be there.
I never imagined a name could carry so much weight when it echoes in the darkness of a cemetery. Not just any name, but mine. Spoken in the silence of dawn, with no one around, coming from a place where, theoretically, only eternal silence should exist. It's strange how the mind tries to find logical explanations for things beyond its control. Maybe it was the wind playing among the tombstones, maybe the distant creak of some rusty gate. But the truth is, there was no wind that night, and the gates were locked, so if it wasn't the wind, what was it? I may sound calm as I tell this now, but that night my hands were shaking, and no matter how hard I tried to breathe deeply, the air felt heavy, almost impossible to fill. With every second, I felt something was about to happen, as if the night itself had stopped to watch what would come next. The newly opened cemetery still smelled of wet earth, and every step I took seemed to awaken invisible echoes. And it was in this ominous atmosphere that it happened. A voice whispered my name, soft yet sharp, as if coming from beneath the earth. They say curiosity is stronger than fear, but that night I couldn't tell where one ended and the other began. And it was at that very point that everything began to transform into something that even I can't explain to this day. If you want to follow each of these real and disturbing stories, subscribe to the channel now and leave your like to strengthen this journey through terror. I'd always believed that the solitude of being a gravedigger was something you learned to endure over time, like a kind of second skin that routine molded until fear became mere indifference. But that night, I realized that there are times when silence isn't an ally, but rather a suffocating presence that observes every gesture and amplifies every thought. The cemetery where I was standing had only been open a few months, in a small American town where almost no one believed in supernatural stories. Perhaps that's why people saw that newly opened field of tombstones as just another public service, unaware that there, the earth still breathed the first memories of the dead. The lanes were still narrow, and the soft dirt paths left deep marks with every step. I had only the dim light of my flashlight and the rhythmic sound of the shovel I carried for company. There were no owls, no insects, nothing but a stillness so extreme it was unsettling. It was as if even the animals had learned to avoid this place. Each time the flashlight beam passed over a freshly painted white cross or a flowerless headstone, I felt a chill run down my spine, and without quite understanding why, I began mentally counting the graves, as if this gesture could keep me awake and away from my mind's wanderings. Yet, as much as I tried to convince myself that nothing was wrong, there was something strange about that night that defied logic. It was as if the air had weight, as if the earth were breathing beneath my feet, and this sensation, though subtle, seemed to be pulling me toward an invisible abyss that would soon begin to open up before me. As I made my way through the rows of newly opened graves, I noticed something in the environment seeming to shift almost imperceptibly, as if the cemetery itself wanted to test my mental endurance that night. The flashlight, which had previously cast a steady, continuous light, began to flicker in small intervals, creating shadows that lengthened and distorted the shapes of the crosses, making each one appear to move slightly whenever my gaze tried to focus. I knew I needed to remain calm, but it was impossible to ignore the fact that the feeling of being watched was becoming increasingly oppressive, and at times it felt like eyes were lurking in every corner of the darkness. Suddenly, amidst the near silence, I heard the sound of shuffling footsteps on the soft earth, slow and heavy, as if someone were walking behind me with deliberate effort. My first instinct was to quickly turn around to confirm, but there was nothing but deep darkness. Still, The impression that those footsteps were there remained etched in my mind, as if the ground had actually vibrated with each movement. I tried to rationalize, telling myself that perhaps it was just the sound of some animal, but the truth was that there was no animal willing to cross that field at that hour. And it was in that instant, between my panting breath and racing heart, that a detail made me freeze completely. I heard my name whispered for the first time, almost imperceptibly, like a thread of a voice that crossed the night to lodge itself directly inside my mind. And in that moment, more than fear, what I felt was the certainty that that call was not a figment of my imagination, but rather the prelude to something much more disturbing that was about to happen. The first whisper could still be mistaken for an illusion of the senses, perhaps a reflection of fatigue or the excessive silence, but when I heard my name again, this time with piercing clarity, there was no doubt that something was truly calling me. The sound was coming from a specific point in the cemetery, and the most terrifying detail was that it was originating from one of the graves recently filled that afternoon. My entire body froze, and although I tried to find plausible explanations, my mind no longer obeyed reason. I knew exactly who had been buried there just hours before, and the memory of the pale, inert face was still fresh in my mind, which made the situation even more unbearable. With each repetition of my name, the voice seemed to gain consistency, as if it were piercing through layers of earth to reach me. It wasn't a neutral call, nor a desperate scream. It was something between an insistent whisper and a muffled plea, the kind of sound that scrapes against the bones and causes a chill that doesn't originate on the skin, but deep within the chest. I felt my heart race uncontrollably, and for a moment I considered running away, abandoning everything and never returning to that place again. But something stronger held me there, an almost morbid need to understand if this was real or simply the product of a mind on the verge of collapse. I took a few steps toward the grave, each movement weighing a ton, as if the earth itself were trying to stop me. The flashlight trembled in my hands, casting uneven beams over the still damp headstone, and the closer I got, the clearer the intonation of the voice became. There was no denying it. Someone or something was calling my name, and the sound seemed to come from right beneath the freshly disturbed earth, as if eternal rest had been violated. And it was at that moment that I realized that the closer I got, the more impossible it would be to go back, because what I was about to hear could not be forgotten, nor erased from memory. Each step I took closer to that grave seemed to multiply the weight of the night, as if the air were growing thicker and each breath required double the effort. I could hear the rustle of my own clothes and the creak of my boots, as if they were shrill sounds amidst the absolute silence. The cold, which until then had been merely a bearable discomfort, transformed into a paralyzing sensation that ran down my spine and spread to my fingers. My flashlight, already shaky, cast irregular, contorted shadows across the newly laid headstone, creating the impression that distorted figures were dancing around the site. When I finally stopped before the grave, the call grew clearer, as if the earth were breathing in short bursts, each exhalation bringing my name with it. It was no longer a distant echo, but a direct whisper, charged with urgency, as if someone were begging for help from the other side. My instincts told me to retreat, abandon that place, and pretend nothing had happened, but my mind, already gripped by a mixture of fear and fascination, insisted on remaining. The shovel I held felt heavier than ever, and for a moment I considered driving it into the earth just to prove to myself that there was nothing but eternal silence. Yet something inside me knew that if I dared to break through that barrier, I might unleash something I could never contain again. I closed my eyes for a moment, trying to control my breathing, but the voice repeated itself, now more insistent, almost pleading, as if time were running out. With Each repetition of my name, the certainty that this wasn't a delusion, grew, and a cruel doubt began to gnaw at my thoughts. What if, in fact, someone was alive down there? This possibility, however unlikely, became an unbearable burden, and it was in this state of anguish that a memory began to take shape in my mind, bringing back the clear image of the funeral I had witnessed hours before. The image of that funeral came back to me as if it had happened seconds ago, not just hours. I remembered the coffin being slowly lowered to the muffled sound of the ropes, the suppressed weeping of the family gathered around, and the weight of the earth falling onto the wood, sealing the fate of someone who, until recently, had breathed like the rest of us. I remember every detail, from the lost look of the eldest son to the farewell gesture of the widow, who held her trembling hands together in prayer, trying to believe that there lay the lifeless body of the one she loved. But now, faced with the whisper that pierced the earth, doubt was beginning to corrode everything I thought I had seen. Could my eyes have deceived me? Could the body not truly be lifeless? The memory of the pale, cold face, the purple lips, and the silence in the coffin should have been enough to convince me, but the more the voice persisted in calling me, the more that certainty crumbled within me. The fear of having unintentionally committed the cruelest mistake anyone could make, burying a living person, began to suffocate me almost unbearably. With every thought, I relived that moment as if it were a silent judgment. Every handful of dirt I had thrown onto that coffin now seemed to scream at me, accusing me of being complicit in something that could never be forgiven. And as I tried to cope with this overwhelming guilt, I realized that the voice no longer seemed to be pleading for help, but rather taking on a new tone, deeper, more charged with something that could not be explained simply as human. Desperation. It was then that I realized the voice was no longer the same one that had called me in the beginning, for what had once sounded like a cry for help had transformed into something dark, laden with a malice that seemed to penetrate the earth, to lodge itself directly in my mind. The tone was now firm, almost mocking, and each time my name was repeated, I felt as if someone were testing the limits of my sanity, slowly stripping away the little courage I had left. It wasn't just a human voice muffled by the wood of the coffin, but something that knew who I was, something that seemed to recognize my deepest fears and use them against me like invisible blades. I took a step back, but the feeling of closeness only increased, as if the ground vibrated in response to my movement. The flashlight slipped from my hand and fell to the damp clay, casting flickering beams of light that cast distorted shadows across the headstone. And it was at that moment that the call ceased to be mere repetition and took on different intonations, sometimes muffled laughter, sometimes pronouncing my name with a tone laden with hatred, as if the entity had been freed by the very act of my getting too close. The sound of nails scraping wood echoed from within the earth, long, desperate scratches that made my teeth chatter nervously, as if I were hearing the agony of someone trying to escape the impossible. My entire body trembled, and despite myself, a part of my mind began to believe that it was no longer the person who had been buried hours before, but something using that voice only as a disguise, something that didn't want help, but rather to lure me closer, to ensnare me. And as terror consumed me, I realized there was no longer any way to separate what was real from what was supernatural, because with each passing second, the darkness seemed to grow more vivid, more aware, and the feeling of being faced with something far beyond human comprehension became inescapable. I'm not sure exactly when I decided I couldn't bear to hear that voice for another second, but I vividly remember the surge of adrenaline that took over my body, forcing me to run as if death itself were chasing me. My boots sank into the soft earth, each step accompanied by the sound of breathing that wasn't my own, and even as I walked away from the grave, The voice continued to echo, repeating my name in an increasingly distorted tone, as if reveling in my despair. I traversed the cemetery's narrow lanes, tripping over wooden crosses and bumping into cold tombstones, until finally I reached the iron gate, which creaked as I was pushed hard, as if resisting me from leaving. Outside, panting and with my chest burning, I thought the silence would bring me some relief, but I was wrong, for I could still hear my name being called, now coming not from a specific point, but scattered through the air, as if the wind itself had learned to speak to me. To this day, I don't know if it was a warning, a curse, or simply the manifestation of something that took advantage of my vulnerability that night. But the only certainty I have is that I wasn't the only one to experience it. Because days later, I heard an even more disturbing story from another gravedigger, and what he experienced that same morning would make my torment seem like just the beginning of something much bigger. I know this may seem like just another frightening story for those who've never dared to walk alone through a cemetery at night. But what I'm about to share is not made up, not rumor, nor is it an exaggeration to impress. There's something unsettling about the old parts of these places, especially those where time seems to have stood still and where every stone, every rusty cross, and every iron door silently carries the secrets of entire families who no longer have anyone to visit them. It's in these narrow mausoleum corridors that I discovered how treacherous darkness can be. For it not only envelops the body, but also infiltrates the mind, distorting sounds and memories until reality itself seems to lose its shape. Imagine yourself surrounded by stone walls that echo every footstep, as if someone were walking beside you, even though you know no one is there. Imagine feeling the wind rushing through the cracks of the ancient gates, bringing an irregular whistling sound that sounds more like a human lament. Now imagine hearing, in this already uncomfortable setting, the sound of a female voice calling your name, clear enough that there's no doubt the call is for you. I could have sworn I was alone that night, and so there was no reason anyone would know my name and speak it in the darkness. Still, what I heard made me wonder if I truly was alone, or if something more ancient and silent had decided to break its eternal rest just to target me. If you want to follow each of these real and disturbing stories, subscribe to the channel now and leave your like to strengthen this journey through terror. The old section of that cemetery always carried a quiet reputation that required no comment among the staff. No one needed to say out loud that they avoided passing through there at night because everyone simply did it instinctively, as if there were an invisible agreement among us that certain areas should remain untouched after the sun disappeared. The mausoleums, built over a century ago with their thick walls and rust-covered iron doors, seemed more like abandoned monuments than resting places, and one only had to walk a few meters to notice that even the air became denser, as if one had to cross an invisible layer of unresolved memories. The faded inscriptions on the tombstones, the leaning crosses barely holding their ground, and the gates that groaned at the slightest touch created a scene that required no stretch of the imagination to become frightening. It was as if these buildings, with their decaying grandeur, had accumulated not only the weight of years, but also the weight of secrets that should never be revealed. I always felt that each mausoleum held not only bodies, but also stifled stories, and when night fell, it seemed those stories found a way to escape through the cracks in the stone. I still remember how the silence there was unlike that of other parts of the cemetery, for in that ancient section the silence had a life of its own, filling the ears almost deafeningly, as if every sound were being purposefully muffled. And it was precisely in this environment of abandonment and oblivion that I noticed the first signs that I was not alone, for the wind blowing through the bars seemed to carry with it a chilling breath that carried something more than the simple movement of air. As I walked between the mausoleums, the wind began to intensify strangely. Not like a common draft that blows and disappears, but like a continuous flow that seemed self-aware, choosing precisely the moments to rise up and envelop me completely. The sound it made as it passed through the cracks in the iron doors resembled an irregular, prolonged whistle, almost like the moan of someone weeping silently. It was impossible not to sense that the wind carried something beyond a simple change in temperature, as if it carried with it fragments of ancient voices mingling with its lament. My flashlight, which had been steady until then, began to flicker irritably, flickering off and on again at increasingly short intervals, casting shadows that danced back and forth, transforming rusted columns and crosses into misshapen figures that writhed before my eyes. With each flicker of the light, I felt the surroundings subtly change, as if the mausoleums were silently approaching, shrinking the space around me and forcing me to walk through ever narrower corridors. I tried tapping the flashlight's metal body lightly, believing it was simply a bad connection, but the truth is, the more I persisted, the more the device seemed to resist, as if something deliberately wanted to plunge me into total darkness. It was at that moment, between the icy breath of the wind and the dance of the shadows projected by the lantern, that I noticed an uncomfortable sensation that was impossible to ignore. It wasn't just the wind that ran through those corridors, there was something accompanying the rhythm of my breathing, as if a second breath was mixed with mine, too subtle to be seen, but present enough to make my skin crawl all over. It was in this stifling atmosphere, between the wind that seemed to whisper of its own accord and the flashlight that insisted on blinding me, that I first heard a voice clear enough to freeze me in place. It wasn't the distant echo of some sound. It wasn't the creaking of iron caused by the gale, nor the noise of my imagination about to surrender to terror. It was a feminine voice, soft yet sharp, pronouncing my name with a clarity that pierced not only the stone corridors, but also the barriers of my own rationality. The sound reverberated between the mausoleum walls, creating the illusion that it came from several places at once, as if every shadow, every gate, and every cross were repeating in unison what I didn't want to believe I was hearing. My heart raced so violently that for a few seconds I lost track of space, and I felt as if my body wouldn't obey me if I tried to run. I remained, motionless, trying to find a logical explanation, and at the same time searching my mind for a memory of anyone who might have followed me there. But I knew I was alone, knew that no one in their right mind would choose to wander that forgotten part of the cemetery in the middle of the night. And that was precisely why fear transformed into something even more cruel. Doubt. It wasn't enough to hear my name. I had to face the question that loomed like an invisible blow. Who could be calling me? And why? The softness of that voice was anything but comforting. On the contrary, it seemed like an invitation to take another step towards something that shouldn't be found. And it was when I took a deep breath, trying to regain some control, that I realized the worst was yet to come, because that voice hadn't just called me, it had chosen me. As soon as the voice faded into the endless echo of the stone corridors, my instinct compelled me to move the flashlight in every direction, as if the light could capture what my eyes still lacked the courage to look at. The flickering beam cut through the cold air and rested on the wall of a mausoleum, and it was at that moment that I noticed a swift movement, a shadow crossing from one tomb to another with the agility of someone who knows every inch of the place. It wasn't an illusion caused by the flashlight's failure, nor a reflection caused by the wind, because the shape shifted consciously, as if to hide from me, ensuring that I could see just enough to leave me in doubt as to its origin. That split second was enough to send a shiver through me, leaving me paralyzed, as if my muscles refused to obey. I considered screaming, but soon realized the futility of that impulse, for who could hear my call amid the suffocating silence of that abandoned sector? I remained motionless, trying to understand whether I should retreat or advance, and in this internal conflict I realized that fear wasn't pushing me away, but rather drawing me deeper into the darkness. Every part of me told me it was dangerous to go forward, but there was something stronger, almost hypnotic, pushing me toward that figure. When I finally took a few hesitant steps, I realized the shadow seemed to be playing with my uncertainty, moving calculatedly, always at the edge of my vision, as if it knew exactly how much doubt to plant to keep me trapped between the desire to flee and the need to discover. And it was in this game of appearances and disappearances that I understood that I was not facing a coincidence, but rather something that had decided to lead me to a destiny from which I could not easily escape. Just when I thought the shadow was the only presence tormenting me that night, the voice returned, and this time there was no echo to obscure its direction. It came clear, direct, coming from so close, I felt as if someone were whispering in the very space between my ear and the darkness. The intonation, soft and drawn out, repeated my name insistently, each syllable carrying a weight that could not be ignored. But what truly made me shiver wasn't just hearing my name, it was the immediate sense of familiarity. I knew that voice. I couldn't pinpoint where it came from or who it belonged to, but each time my name was spoken, something inside my memory stirred, as if trying to summon a forgotten memory. My mind desperately searched for a face, a moment, any reference that could explain why that timbre was so intimate. The more I tried to understand, the more my body refused to accept logic, because the only possible conclusion was also the most terrifying. That voice couldn't be there, not at that time, not in that place. The discomfort turned into psychological terror, because it was no longer just an external presence that frightened me, but the possibility that I was hearing someone I had known in life, someone who shouldn't be standing, much less searching for me amidst the abandoned mausoleums. And it was in this conflict between reason and the impossible that I understood that the voice wasn't just calling me, it was haunting me, because with each repetition, it seemed closer, as if the darkness around me had taken shape and decided to shorten the distance between us. It was in this moment of impossible recognition that the night decided to show its cruelest face, for the wind suddenly increased, bringing with it a cold that seemed to cut the skin like invisible blades, and my flashlight, already flickering irritably, went out completely, plunging me into a darkness so dense I felt I could touch it with my hands. The mausoleum area, which until then I had only seen fragmentarily, transformed into an oppressive maze where each corridor merged into the next, and no matter how hard I tried to orient myself by memory, it was as if space had distorted around me, trapping me in an invisible circle. It was in this suffocating darkness that I heard not only the female voice, repeating my name now with a harsher, more impatient intonation, but also other sounds that made me wonder if I was still alone. Slow footsteps echoed on the stone floor, as if someone or something were circling me, gauging the exact distance before approaching. At times, I swore I heard deep, short, and far too close breaths, as if emitting from right behind me, and every attempt to turn to spot the source proved futile, as nothing but darkness greeted me. Little by little, the fear that had already been eating away at my sanity transformed into a feeling of inescapable persecution, as if that presence had deliberately cornered me, waiting only for the right moment to reveal itself. My hands trembled uncontrollably, and the absence of the flashlight made each second feel like an eternity in which time had stopped flowing. And it was in this state of growing desperation that I realized that no matter how hard I tried to resist, I would soon be forced to see what the darkness so insistently hid from me. Just when the darkness seemed absolute and my mind threatened to give in to panic, the flashlight switched on by itself, projecting a flickering beam of light against the stone wall in front of me. And it was at that moment that the impossible materialized before me, for there stood a clear shadow, perfectly drawn, as if it were the silhouette of a hooded woman, motionless and with her back turned, waiting for me to take the first step toward her. The detail that terrified me most was not the presence of the shadow itself, but the fact that there was no one there to justify it. There was no body, no physical figure, just that dark form projected without origin, as if the night itself had decided to show me a memory of something that didn't belong in this world. My entire body collapsed with fear, yet I still felt that if I retreated, I would never find peace. I took a step forward, only to see the shadow slide gently aside, passing through the stone wall, and disappearing as if absorbed by the mausoleum. I ran to the spot in a desperate attempt to understand, but all I found was the cold surface of the stone, without cracks, without signs of passage. The only thing that remained was the sound of the female voice echoing more. There are places within a cemetery that, even for those who work there every day, carry a different, heavy aura, as if they belong neither entirely to the world of the living nor to the world of the dead, but occupied a borderland where the inexplicable manifests itself without asking permission. The abandoned chapel that stood in the center of the grounds was one such place, and from the first time I crossed the cemetery's gates, I heard whispered stories among the staff, hurried comments that spoke of strange echoes and invisible presences that insisted on revealing themselves only to those who dared to cross its doors after midnight. I confess that for a long time, I dismissed all of this as rumors created to heighten the natural fear everyone feels in the face of death. But that night, when the silence seemed denser than ever, I understood that there was far more truth to these stories than I was prepared to accept. I didn't go to the chapel out of curiosity, but out of necessity, because I'd heard an unusual noise coming from that direction, and as part of my job, I couldn't simply ignore it. I walked toward the building with my flashlight in hand, and with each step, my heart seemed to sink in my chest. Not because of the distance I'd covered, but because of the premonition that something awaited me. You might not believe it, but sometimes we feel like the air itself is trying to warn us, and at that moment, everything seemed to be trying to stop me. Even so, I pressed on, never imagining that what awaited me as I crossed those stone walls would be far more than I was willing to face. If you want to follow each of these real and disturbing stories, subscribe to the channel now and leave your like to strengthen this journey through terror. The chapel had stood there for over a century, isolated in the center of the cemetery like a scar that time refused to erase. Its stone walls bore deep cracks, as if the structure itself no longer had the strength to support itself, and the roof, covered in moss and dry leaves, leaned dangerously, leaking drops of moisture that trickled through the cracks and fueled the musty smell that pervaded the entire space. The wooden benches, once used to accommodate grieving families, were now nothing more than fragile, crumbling skeletons, covered in thick dust and covered in cobwebs that glistened in the slightest change of light. Walking through that space was like passing through a reliquary of dark memories, where every detail seemed to carry the memory of hundreds of forgotten funerals. There was a sense of utter abandonment, but not emptiness, and it is precisely this difference that makes these places unbearably unsettling. The silence was unlike that found elsewhere in the cemetery, for inside the chapel it seemed to mold itself, stretching and contracting as if breathing along with me, waiting for the exact moment to transform into something tangible. With each step I took, the sound of my boots against the ground echoed disproportionately, as if someone were repeating my movements late, imitating me without me being able to identify the source. As I stared at the shattered stained glass windows, letting in pale fragments of moonlight, I realized the space didn't just seem abandoned, but rather in constant anticipation, as if awaiting my arrival. And it was at that moment that the tower clock began to strike midnight, each chime resonating with an almost ritualistic force, anticipating that something about to unfold within that place would change the course of that night. As the tower clock began to announce the arrival of midnight, each stroke sounded like an invisible hammer, striking not only the heavy air inside the chapel, but also the rhythm of my heart, which seemed to match that slow, suffocating beat. The sound reverberated unevenly, as if the stone walls worn by time amplified and distorted the echo, creating the illusion that each chime was coming from a different direction. It was impossible not to feel that, with each new stroke, something was drawing closer, as if the space between the world of the living and the dead were narrowing with almost ritualistic precision, opening the way for presences that had previously remained dormant. The wind, blowing through the broken stained glass windows, carried fragments of the sound, prolonging the effect and making the chimes drag on for endless seconds. At one point, I had the distinct impression that I heard not only the metallic clang of the bell, but also muffled voices, like a distant murmur that mingled with the echo and tried to blend in with the cadence of the beats. I closed my eyes for a moment, trying to regain my sanity, but as I did so, the feeling of vulnerability increased, as if I were willingly placing myself at the mercy of whatever lurked there. When the last chime finally ceased, the silence brought no relief, but rather an unbearable anticipation, as if it were a harbinger of what was to come. I knew that from that moment on there was no turning back, because the mere fact of being inside the chapel at midnight felt like an accepted invitation, a permission granted to something waiting only for this moment to manifest itself. And it was precisely in this pause between the sound and the emptiness that I decided to advance toward the chapel's main door, even without imagining what I would find upon entering. With the last chimes still echoing in my memory, I approached the chapel's main door, its ancient hinges creaking as if protesting my presence. As I pushed it open, the sound reverberated throughout the space, drawn out and deep, like a metallic wail that seemed more a warning than a simple consequence of accumulated rust. As soon as I crossed the threshold, I felt as if I were passing through an invisible barrier, as if I were entering not just a physical environment, but a dimension where time moved differently. The air inside was thick, heavy with dust and mold, but also with something inexplicable, an invisible weight that settled on my shoulders and slowed every movement, as if the atmosphere itself conspired against my will to remain there. My eyes took a while to adjust, and the flashlight still clinging to my hands illuminated only disconnected fragments, pieces of broken pews, shattered stained glass windows that let in pale beams of moonlight, and walls stained with waterlogged stains that resembled deformed human figures. Every detail seemed alive, as if waiting for my attention to transform into something even more menacing. The smell of rotting wood and wet stone mingled with an undefined metallic odor, inducing nausea and the sensation that the place was not only old, but corrupt. I took a few hesitant steps down the central aisle, the sound of my boots echoing loudly, as if echoing from within the very earth beneath the floor. With each step, I felt as if the entire chapel were reacting to my presence, stretching the silence, shaping the shadows, and waiting for me to do something to disrupt the fragile balance that held the invisible contained. And it was precisely at this point, when I began to believe the worst was merely a figment of my imagination, that I heard the first call coming not from a single voice, but from several at once. The moment I convinced myself I was alone, The silence was rent by something that couldn't be mistaken for wind, creaking wood, or a tired imagination. My name echoed for the first time within the chapel, but not in isolation, but as part of an eerie chorus formed by multiple voices rising in unison, each with its own intonation, as if an invisible congregation had gathered just to welcome me. The sound was deep, low and drawn out, reminiscent of a distorted liturgical chant. But at the same time, high notes overlapped, creating a disturbing contrast that seemed to penetrate my body and lodge directly in my mind. My heart began to pound wildly, and as much as I tried to remain calm, I realized that each repetition of my name grew in intensity, as if those voices were trying to break through the stone walls to surround me on all sides. It was impossible to pinpoint a precise source, for the echo seemed to come from above, below, to the sides, and even from within the broken benches that remained motionless in front of me. Most terrifyingly, there was no apparent anger in the tone of the voices, but rather a kind of solemnity, as if they were not simply calling, but conducting a ceremony of which I was the center. At every moment I wondered if I should flee, but something paralyzed me, as if my presence had been foreseen, as if that chapel had been waiting precisely for me to complete a ritual interrupted in the past. The psychological weight was so great that I began to feel a strange vertigo, as if the ground beneath my feet were breathing along with me, and the thin air made it difficult even to think. It was in this state of mental confusion that I realized something even more disturbing. Those voices weren't just repeating my name, they were multiplying, overlapping, until they formed an almost unbearable mass of sound, preparing the ground for a revelation I wasn't yet ready to face. As the choir continued, I felt my mind waver between two equally terrifying convictions. First, that these voices were real, coming from something I couldn't see. Second, that everything was happening only inside my head, as if the pressure of the environment had finally broken through my defenses. I tried to convince myself that the echo of the chapel could explain the multiplicity of intonations, but that explanation lost its meaning when I realized that each voice had its own rhythm, specific pauses, and even different breathing pitches, as if they were truly distinct individuals gathered to speak my name. I closed my eyes for a few seconds, trying to regain some control. But the darkness within proved even more cruel, because even without my sight, the voices didn't stop. On the contrary, they seemed to draw closer, filling the space around me like an invisible, slowly narrowing circle. My body began to react with chills, and my hands trembled so badly that the flashlight nearly slipped from my fingers, leaving me vulnerable to the darkness that seemed eager to take over. It was at that moment that I noticed something even more disturbing. The voices not only repeated my name, but began to overlap in disjointed words, fragments of sentences that dissolved before I could comprehend them, as if communicating with each other in a forgotten language, letting out just enough to torment me. This mixture of sounds created an almost hypnotic effect, as if trying to weaken my resistance and lull me into a state of surrender. And it was precisely at that point, when I could no longer distinguish between delirium and reality, that a decision forced itself upon me: to raise the flashlight and confront my surroundings once and for all. Breathing raggedly and my heart hammering against my chest, I raised the lantern with trembling hands, as if raising a final shield against something invisible. The beam of light cut through the chapel's heavy darkness, revealing rows of broken pews that remained motionless and covered in dust, devoid of any sign of life. Any expectation of finding hidden figures, distorted bodies, or even incarnate shadows was crushed by the absolute void. And yet the chorus of voices continued unabated, echoing with even greater force, as if mocking my attempt to confront reality. The contrast between what I saw and what I heard was so stark that my mind seemed to fragment, unable to accept that two such opposing truths could coexist in the same space. I moved the flashlight slowly from side to side, illuminating every detail of the chapel. The altar covered in thick dust, the walls stained with water leaks that dripped like dark tears, the broken stained glass windows letting in a pale moonlight. Nothing but abandonment and oblivion, and yet the voices filled every corner, growing in intensity until they became a deafening mass of sound, an invisible weight that pressed against my ears and made my entire body vibrate as if it were merely a receptacle for that sound. For a moment, the flashlight failed, flickering in short intervals that cast distorted shadows against the walls, twisted figures moving with the wavering light, giving the impression that the invisible congregation had finally assumed grotesque forms before me. When the light stabilized again, nothing remained but the empty pews, but the certainty that I was not alone had already ingrained itself in my mind. And it was in that instant, as I tried to draw back for air, that I realized something even worse lurked, waiting just for the right moment to reveal itself. Just when I thought I'd faced the pinnacle of fear, the chapel revealed it still held its final trap. A metallic crash echoed behind me, so loud it reverberated off the shattered stained glass windows and sent dust falling in heavy clouds from the ceiling. The door, which I'd left ajar, slammed shut, locking me inside as if invisible hands had pushed it with all their might. The impact made me instinctively turn the flashlight toward the entrance, but all I saw was the cold, immobile surface of the ancient wood, which now stood like an insurmountable wall between me and freedom. The voices, which until then had echoed in an almost liturgical chorus, turned to muffled laughter, repeating my name in an irregular cadence, as if celebrating the perfect trap. I ran to the door and pushed with my weight, but nothing gave way. The air grew heavier by the second, and the sensation that the chapel itself was closing in on me grew like a suffocating embrace. It was at that moment, amidst absolute despair, that I realized the night had not yet revealed all, and that the darkness held something even darker waiting for me. If you've made it this far, get ready, because this is just one of the stories that reveal what happens when the living get too close to the secrets of death. Subscribe to the channel to follow the next episodes and discover what another gravedigger experienced that same night, in a story that will make this echo seem like just the prelude to true terror.